Chapter 5, Aftermath. Victoria was lying in her hospital bed, her eyes swollen and red from crying. At her side, her mother also had swollen eyes to cry with her daughter, while with sweet words she tried to console the bereaved Victoria. Mother and daughter faced that tragedy, both broken by pain, united by their love. For Victoria, everything seemed very unreal still, as if she lived a dark, anguishing, and horrible nightmare. A few hours ago she felt like the luckiest woman in the world, believing that she would marry a man she loved and that he loved her, and that she would start a new life. Only a few hours later she was lying in a hospital bed, after having discovered that her fiancé was a cad scoundrel who cheated on her, after opening her eyes and understanding that their love was a lie, and living a brutal attempt of gang rape, a savage assault in which she was violently abused and was about to suffer the consummation of the sexual assault, when the eruption of a stranger caused a chaotic fight, something that it was still very confused in her mind. Victoria wanted to erase from her mind what had happened in the last hours. She would have wanted to erase the images of those dirty, obscene, and grotesque men, those wild beasts that assaulted her. She would like to forget their faces and their lustful looks over her, to forget their hands over her body touching and poking at her intimate places, forgetting the smell of their breaths and their bodies, forgetting that they stripped her and exposed her body to their sadistic looks, hurting her modesty and humiliating her without mercy. Victoria was emotionally destroyed, her heart shattered, her mind plunged in an infinite despair, wanting to die to stop that grief. Her mother's pain was as much as her own, suffering helplessly to see her daughter broken that way and unable to alleviate it and to give her peace. Victoria stubbornly refused to eat, but her mother insisted with patience, love, and many pleas. Finally, Victoria agreed to eat a little, and when the nurse brought the tray with the food and placed it on the bed, Victoria began eating some bites very slowly, encouraged by her mother. After a while, Victoria had finally eaten little more than half the content of her hospital ration. Then Victoria's older brother, Ernest, entered the room for the second time that day and with a shy smile tried to hide his own pain, to comfort and encourage his sister. Victoria pouted and shed some tears when she saw him again, but made an effort not to cry again. Ernest tried to distract his sister with frivolous talk and trying to joke a little, clumsily. Victoria made an effort to smile and pretend serenity because she felt compassion for the pain of her mother and her brother. At one point, Victoria it got dirty little the edge of her mouth and a cheek with the sauce of a food, and her brother Ernest extended his hand to clean it affectionately. But Victoria reacted with shock and panic, and violently pulled her brother's hand away with her own hand, hitting it almost reflexively. "Do not touch me!" Victoria exclaimed almost hysterical. Victoria's mother and brother were amazed, and after the surprise, Victoria's mother looked away and began to cry. Ernest also shed some tears and had to make an effort not to break himself. "Forgive me, Ernest. I did not want." Victoria exclaimed in anguish at having hurt her brother, but could not continue because she broke again and hiding her face with her hands began to cry hysterically. "Easy, Victoria, nothing happens. Do not cry, please." Ernest exclaimed worried and affectionate, trying to comfort her. "Honey, do not do this. Please stop crying," Victoria's mother said, extending her arms to try to hug her. A few minutes later Ernest was in the hallway with Charles and Harriet, while Nancy and Victoria's mother comforted her in the room. Ernest's eyes were red from crying, while his girlfriend Harriet grabbed him by the arm and leaned her head on his shoulder, trying to comfort him. "I'd like to find those bastards to kill them with my own hands. I want to see those damned bastards dead. Not even killing them, they will pay for what they did to Vicky," exclaimed Ernest, making an effort not to scream. "I feel the same, Ernest, but there is nothing we can do but wait for the police to catch them. Fortunately that guy who intervened prevented the worst from happening. Now we must help Victoria to recover," Charles replied. At that moment, Stanley, Victoria's fiancé, appeared in the hallway. Harriet saw him nervous, Charles angry and worried, and Ernest lost his head. Ernest ran towards him and with a strong push threw him against the wall. Then he grabbed Stanley by the lapels of his jacket and cornered him. Charles and Harriet ran after him, and each of them tried to hold Ernest. "What are you doing here, you damned bastard?" Ernest asked, angry and threatening. "I am concerned about Victoria," Stanley exclaimed, struggling to try to push away Ernest, but he pushed him hard and hit Stanley's head against the wall. "You have nothing to do with Victoria," Ernest exclaimed. "Victoria is my fiancée and I," Stanley replied, but a strong hand of Ernest closed on his neck and did not let him continue. "Dare to say that again, dare to say that you have some right over Victoria, and I will kill you. Because of you, my sister was assaulted. You caused all this with what you did last night," exclaimed Ernest almost hysterically. "Leave it, Ernest. This bastard is not worth it," Charles said, trying to get Ernest away from him. "Charles is right, do not do a mad thing because of this dirty bastard," Harriet cried pleadingly while holding her boyfriend's arm. "If you approach my sister again, you're a dead man," Ernest threatened with rage and murderous look. "You cannot stop me from seeing Victoria," Stanley replied furiously. "Yes, he can, and I can too," exclaimed Victoria's mother, watching the group from a few steps. After leaving Victoria's bedroom, "Ernest, get away from him." Ernest reluctantly pulled away from him, his gaze steadily on Stanley as his mother approached Stanley. "Johanna, I'm sorry, Stanley said, but could not continue because Victoria's mother slapped him. "I never liked you, you never cheated on me, I always knew what material you were made of. I always knew you were a bastard womanizer, vicious and macho. God knows I tried to open the eyes to my daughter, but she was blind and deceived by you, dazzled by your beautiful packaging, even though she knew that nobody in the family approved you, that none of the people who love her trusted you. She insisted on loving you and you finally hurt her as we all expected, and what is worse, because of you, she has suffered this horrible tragedy from which she may never recover. My sweet and fragile daughter has been damaged because of the man she thought would protect her, the rest of her life. I know that my daughter must make her own decisions, I know that she will most likely have to talk with you at least once more in her life, she will have to hear you, and listen to your lies and your pathetic excuses. And if after all, she decides to forgive you and stay by your side, God forbid, I know I cannot do anything but curse the day what she met you, but meanwhile, while she is in that bed and the people that we really love her we try to pick up the pieces of her to put it together, we will not allow you to approach her. We will do anything to prevent you from seeing her, and one of us will always be here, and I do not care if there is a scandal in the hospital, but I imagine that you are worried about seeing your precious reputation affected. Now, I beg you to leave, if you have some decency, and I want you to know that I will never forgive you or stop hating you, whatever happens, and whether you are or not by my daughter's side," said Victoria's mother with cold anger, hatred, and contempt in her gaze. Stanley saw her with surprise, and then with anger and shame, feeling humiliated. He saw the others with contempt, and then he turned his back on them and left. Then, Victoria's mother felt her legs fail and she was going to fall on her knees, but her son Ernest grabbed her, and then Harriet also helped her, while Charles went to look for a nurse. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, in a huge Victorian mansion, Lord Melbourne and Lord Byron were talking when the tone of the video intercom alerted them that someone was with a car in the gate that gave access to the walled property of the house. Lord Melbourne saw who was the driver of the car and smiled, and then pressed the button that triggered the opening of the gate. A couple of minutes later the bell rang from the main door of the mansion, and Lord Melbourne opened the door to meet a man standing in the doorway. Anbar Province, Iraq, 2004. The man remained tied in the chair, in that small room of a large and dilapidated old house. He was a young man, just over 25 years old, with white skin, green eyes, and light brown hair. He was a tall man, 6 feet tall, and a thin. He was quite handsome, although the bruises caused by the blows and blood that covered his face made his appearance look bad at that moment. He was dressed in a military uniform for the desert, which was very dirty and deteriorated, torn at several points, and wore military boots. For a couple of hours, he had endured beatings and torture with electric shocks, but he knew that the worst was yet to come. The man knew when he was captured that he had no hope of getting out of that trance alive, and in his mind dazed by pain and fear he had only memories of his family, especially his mother who would be destroyed by losing her son. Now he was just trying to muster the strength to endure with dignity and courage his inevitable death and the suffering that would come before, as he watched the darkness of the night seep through the windows. But then something happened. It began to hear shots and explosions. In other rooms of the house, the terrorists wielded their weapons firing at barely visible figures, almost invisible figures that moved at an extraordinary, supernatural speed, like hurricane gusts that ran amongst the terrorists. One of those figures fell on one of the terrorists and a few moments later the militiaman fell to the ground with his throat cut open, with a wound that looked like it was made with a knife. Another figure fell on another terrorist and the guerrilla fell to the ground with his neck broken and his head turned at a 180-degree angle in a grotesque way, with his face now his back. Another terrorist saw with horror how a figure fell on one of his companions and then his comrade fell to the ground and something that looked like a human foot in a boot fell on the terrorist's head and surprisingly the head exploded like a watermelon. They would have crushed it with a mace, throwing brains and blood in all directions. Another terrorist was attacked by a figure and collapsed with a hole in his chest, while his heart fell to the floor next to his head. When another gust hit another terrorist, an arm of the guerrilla fighter fell to the ground, detached from the body of the guerrilla fighter who collapsed, howling in pain in a pool of blood. Another gunman was violently projected towards the ceiling and later fell to the ground, while one of his companions fell back on him, violently beaten by a figure, with a grenade that he tried to throw in the hand and both terrorists blow up. In the small room where the young man was tied to the chair he listened to the commotion with the hope that it was a rescue operation, when the door of the room burst, and a terrorist entered by the threshold of the door flying through the air, as violently pushed by an unknown force and fell to the ground unconscious. Then a tall, imposing man, dressed in civilian clothes, but with appropriate clothing for hiking in the desert, including military boots, walked through the threshold of the door. "Don't worry, Lieutenant, we came to look for you," the man said reassuringly as he approached the hostage to free him from his bonds. But at that moment someone leaned on the threshold and threw a grenade at the floor near the man and the hostage. Without thinking, the savior threw himself to the ground on the grenade and with his body contained the explosion that otherwise would have killed the hostage. The man tied in chair saw with terror and despair how that stranger had lost his life trying to save him and then saw when the terrorist who had thrown the grenade now wielded a Kalashnikov rifle and was preparing to pepper him. He closed his eyes waiting for his end, but he heard a scream and opened them to see an unusual scene. Lord Byron was behind the terrorist holding him tightly while biting him in the neck. The fangs of the vampire who had once been a celebrated poet were nailed firmly in the militiaman's neck, while he sucked with a loud noise, drawing blood from the man's body. The guerrilla convulsed with his eyes wide and saliva leaving his mouth, while the vampire did not stop drawing the blood, biting greedily, like a wild predator that had captured an animal of a weaker species and was devouring it. The hostage watched in horror as a man killed another by biting his neck like a scavenger bird, sucking his blood with a noise he would never forget. After a couple of minutes, Lord Byron extracted all the blood from the bully's body and then dropped him to the ground as if it were a waste, a piece of garbage. Blood dripped from Lord Byron's mouth and jaw in a grotesque way, as it would drip on a hyena's muzzle after a succulent banquet. The sclera of Lord Byron's eyes was absolutely red, giving a terrifying look to his eyes. "Damn it, Byron! Did you have to do it in front of the hostage?" Lord Melbourne said with a mixture of anger and irony as he got up from the floor, with his clothes very damaged by the explosion of the grenade, but without any apparent wound on his body, although beneath him was a large blood stain. "I had not fed for hours and you know that puts me in a bad mood," exclaimed Lord Byron somewhat angrily. "In addition, he has the sufficient degree of access to confidential information." "Okay, I suppose I'll have to feed myself, too, said Lord Melbourne as he addressed the terrorist he had thrown through the door and who, upon awakening from his swoon, watched in horror as he lay on his back on the floor. Lord Melbourne took him by the neck and lifted him without problems, and took him out of the room while the terrorist screamed in terror. Through the shadows projected by a lamp on a wall, the hostage could see how Lord Melbourne approached his head to the neck of the militiaman and bit him as Lord Byron had done with the other terrorist. When he returned to the room, blood dripped from Lord Melbourne's mouth while his eyes were red like Lord Byron's. "Who are you two?" asked the scared hostage. "It's a long trip to follow ya, Lieutenant. We'll have plenty of time to explain it to you," said Lord Melbourne as he wiped the blood from his mouth and jaw with a handkerchief. London, at present. The man Lord Melbourne and Lord Byron had rescued so many years earlier in Iraq was standing in the doorway of Lord Melbourne's mansion, now a man just under 40 years old and dressed modishly. "It's been some time, Lord Melbourne," the man said with a mocking and friendly smile. "A few months is like a second to me, Chris. Welcome back to your home," replied Lord Melbourne with a funny smile. The man entered and the door closed. While away from there, in a hospital, Victoria awoke with a start after sleeping for a short time, remembering the hazel green eyes of the man who had saved her. Tears welled up in her eyes.